All right, cool. Welcome to this pilot experimental session of making sense of the media. Um, Let me actually start sharing my screen. Um, yeah, I mean, last week I ran a experimental session on gratitude. I think like as we develop our civic gym, I'm especially interested in sessions that we can do on a repeated basis, that exercise a particular muscle that is just useful for your entire life. And so making sense of the media, I think you can make sense of why I picked that topic. Just the objectives are let's learn about like this meta news concept, just very high level. Then let's practice playing a propagandist. All right, so I'm going to start with a quote from a quote. So we are all bombarded with news. There is 24/7 coverage across numerous outlets, and the cacophony of social media and citizen journalists, along with burgeoning news, junk news, disinformation, and narrative warfare. In many ways, the news itself has become part of the problem, as a staggering number of different articles and narratives make it hard to make sense of the world. What do you think about this quote? You can unmute.
I'll say 100%. I know, Gary, I mentioned at the beginning that I had to move into a different room, and that's because my grandfather has the news on 24 hours a day,
Can I ask
and it's
what?
playing in the living room. It's either CNN or MSNBC. Um,
Nice.
it's interesting because sometimes the content is interesting. Like Rachel Maddow did something about like the Secret Service, which was interesting, and sometimes they're replaying the same thing on the top of every hour. Um, it's all kind of the same perspective across everybody.
Does your grandpa realize that they were kind of replaying the same thing?
I'm not sure if he does, and that may just
Hmm.
be more of an age thing,
Yeah.
but he likes it.
He likes it. It's like almost like like almost like comforting. What about anyone else?
I think there's like this strange dissonance between like the incentives forwarded by the attention economy versus like the ethics of journalism and like the fact that you're kind of like responsible for people's interpretation of what's actually going around in the world right now. And so just like the infrastructure of media, it's like your power is kind of defined by how long you can keep viewers engaged or listeners engaged. And that sometimes means that we have to kind of make things appealing at the expense of the truth. And I think people realize this first with like yellow journalism, but after that happened, and then TV came, radio. Radio's not that bad, but I think TV primarily, and then social media, it has left us with like, yeah, an information glut.
I
Jacob,
think
sorry, Jacob, you were like laughing at. Were you laughing at something that like yellow journalism or something?
It's actually we were just learning about that in history the other day,
Oh,
and so
okay.
I think that was like the first really big incident I had remember like in like what's happened in history and especially America of like journalism being used as a tool to start a war. It's probably been stuff
Hmm.
back before that happening too. I think that's pretty poignant.
Hmm. Go ahead, Madison.
I was just gonna say I like this quote, but I think it definitely downplays the role that the media plays and just how much a part of the problem it is. It says it has become a part of the problem. I think it is way bigger than that. The media like dictates the world's conscious. If it's not covered, it's like signaled that either people don't even know about it or that it's not important. And there's just a lot of consequences that come about when only like a certain group of people get to decide what we talk about as a country and a world.
100%. So, in response to this problem, um, one of the guys that's like most pushing for better analysis of the news or meta news is Daniel Schmuckenberger. He says we need a way to process the news in response to a disorganized and polarized media. And I couldn't agree more. So, want to pose a question. What's different about the 2020s media landscape versus that of the 1990s? And what are the implications? You can take it one at a time as well.
I'm gonna push the buck back a tiny bit further to like the 1950s, 60s, 70s. I remember like seeing this quote, like there is no like Walter Cronkite anymore. For those who don't know, like Walter Cronkite was a broadcast journalist for I think ABC or CBS. Like everybody trusted him completely to tell the truth about what was happening. There's like such a big trust of the media and the face of the person that gives you the news that isn't here anymore. I feel like there's so much more distrust of media. But you guys can enunciate on that further too.
Yeah, I mean, with Cronkite, one one part of why people like him were less polarizing were because there was market incentives to be less polarizing and actually speak to as many people as possible. Right now, you can narrow down to the smallest niche possible. You can even run targeted ads on a lot of social media platforms to reach a very particular type of person, and then just milk them, right, for say exactly what they want to hear. But before you had like what, three to five to seven channels in the mid-century.
I'll say something interesting that I was listening to like an NPR podcast that they were talking about. And this is probably a little farther back than the 90s. Is that there was a period of time where like you had to be pretty wealthy to even afford to get regular news, like for you to get a newspaper. And then even when TV first started coming around, not everyone had a TV in their home. So they were marketing to a very specific audience of who's actually watching the news and what news do they care about. And we still carry many of those norms into today of what kind of news we cover. So the example they raised was like, you're not going to turn on MSNBC and see them covering, all right, if you were recently laid off because of COVID, this is how you get your unemployment benefits, because that's not their audience. And that's the kind of news that we need way more of. And that it's just that news channels are still marketing towards the most profitable audience, which is not necessarily the audience that needs news the most, at least in the way it exists right now.
Such a great point. Anyone else?
I think I heard about like Ronald Reagan playing a part in repealing like the fairness doctrine, which actually was like a policy to make sure that media does not disinform its audience. But I think another distinction between the 1990s and the 2020s is that the rise of social media, which like at first I think meant that people would like information would be more democratized, but I think that a byproduct of that is the creation of groupthink and then cancel culture and trends falling in and out. And I think that has created like a strange economy of information sharing.
I like your use of economy. Go ahead, Jacob.
And also like media in general. There's infinite media that you could consume. Like you could scroll through Instagram or TikTok for hours and still have millions of other things to look at. So what I realized is like because algorithms do tailor to what you've been looking at, spending time looking at, there's like a bit like a subliminal like warfare that's going on. It's like you can like implant like a meme of an idea in someone's mind, like change the way that they see everything similar to that thing. Like for example, I know like a lot of white supremacists have been created via online boards and news pages, right? And so I think there's a lot of power now that different sects can have to like influence individuals who just want to go out and consume media.
I think it was interesting for me to really try to parse the argument um, that people were making that Russia really used Facebook to influence our election, and what people or kind of widely agree, or I don't know, intelligence services, etc., agree on is that like Russia spent 150K on like Facebook ads to sow discord or whatever, but people are sowing discord for free. Like Russia wasn't doing like if you ask anyone that's like really honest in the political space, they're trying to totally demonize the other side, and they're doing this while they're like sitting on the toilet, just like they don't have to be paid by Russia to do these things. So it's just something really interesting to think about, like that like the amount of discord that is being sown is literally in the billions. It's not 150K, right? It's so. All right. So here's a question, another question. Today, what are skills you need to not be a constant victim or tool of propagandists?
I like my instinct is to be like, open-minded and read multiple sources. But I think you have to know like when to not follow any sources at all and be able to like formulate your own opinion based on like kind of like a combination of everything at all. Like it's not just like a matter of picking the narrative you want to buy into. It's creating your own like what you believe in, even if no one in particular is like preaching it or advocating for it.
So another way to kind of say what you're saying, I think, is like first principles thinking. Like, how do you base? If you end up taking a stance, you don't have to actually, but if you do, it's based on like what you have individually verified as like truths, versus immediately jumping to a side. And just trying to individually validate or invalidate individual claims that different outlets people are making.
Yeah, and not just buying into the fact that like there's sides and that issues are binary, and like being able to sit somewhere like on the spectrum of certain issues as well.
Adding on to that, like this isn't optimal, but just like realizing that you don't need to always take a side, especially if you don't have enough information. Sometimes that's does more harm rather than good.
100%.
And I'll quickly add too that if you do take a stand, knowing that you don't have to share it, right? Like when you go through the process of trying to share your stand, you can be unduly influencing other people's opinions when really your own opinion may not be that well informed / heavily informed off of personal experience, and thus will be different across different populations.
For sure. What else?
I mean, what I try to do is I try to read something and be like, what are the facts here? Like, what happened? And what are they saying about what happened? And you kind of like sieve out, like, what do I need to know? And like, what influences the author trying to exert, or like, what's their bias about what happened? So it's like another thing is like, having principles about like, oh yeah, is this good or bad? Like having a couple like rules in your head about like, oh yeah, like this person, stole millions of dollars to go do something else. Like, I think that's bad. And so like having like a moral code that doesn't fluctuate with who is being covered can definitely fortify you against being swayed in the direction of what moral system, whatever else you're consuming is trying to make you adopt.
Yeah, so part of what you're suggesting is that people should forget like just having skills that you kind of unleash when you're consuming news. It's like you probably want to do some you want to do some pre-work. What do I actually believe, regardless of who's saying it? right? So I'm not just swayed by one propaganda outlet or another.
Exactly.
And yeah. And I'll add on what Jacob's saying too, is that understanding that there is no such thing as objectivity. Like there is no author on the planet that can be totally objective. And that in many ways, this like idea that media should be objective is inherently flawed, because people and populations that are the most marginalized on certain causes are then pressured to hide their own experience of like, I'm going to be unbiased, even though like my people group is being affected by this, and acknowledging that we should not think of things as objective because they aren't. And I think a good example of that, I mean, if you think about the stuff going on with like Andrew Cuomo in New York and like CNN's coverage of it versus if you looked at any other like outlet, it's different because Chris Cuomo was Andrew Cuomo's brother, right? So, you know, let's just be real that CNN can't be objective and we shouldn't pretend that they should be. And that obviously propagates to other sorts of sources as well.
I think that's really powerful. So it's like, what kind of we're almost saying, what kind of principles do we have to not be tools of propaganda? And that's like not assuming that any outlet or person is objective. That's beautiful, because I think the people that are most susceptible to propaganda are people that think that their preferred outlets are the most objective. Right? Cool. This is great. All right. So another question. When we consume media from any person or media outlet, okay, so we kind of went over some of this, but let's just why don't we rattle some out? What should be going through our minds?
I try to kind of understand the language that they're using. And so, since, like Zoe said, the objectivity doesn't exist, I feel like almost every piece of literature has some sort of agenda, but how they present it and how they offer like counter arguments is also very important to understand, I believe. And then how are they trying to appeal to you? Are they trying to go for a more logos oriented framework, or are they using more emotional appeal? And I think a lot of people are vulnerable to falling into identity. So if they see their identities resonating or reflected in the writing, they tend to be more compelled towards it. But I think that can be a very dangerous rabbit hole of falling into disinformation. So, yeah.
I was like, understanding where the funding's coming from. Are they disclosing where their funding's coming from? Some sources, I'll specifically cite NPR, are really good about saying so and so is one of our funders before covering it, but a lot of other news sources don't. And so that does influence the way they cover things.
I love that. I was thinking about that when I was watching a PBS documentary yesterday, and the Koch brothers fund some PBS documentaries. And hang with me here. I don't think that's a problem in some cases, because it depends if the subject matter is a conflict of interest with their business, right? So, and I'm sure I don't know, it's hard to, how would I know all the ties to their businesses, right? But like, just let's say theoretically, if you're funding something and it doesn't affect your power and success in a meaningful way, I think, I guess it's not, my point is this, it's just not binary, right? Just because you may not like a funder doesn't mean that the source is completely like crap.
I don't know. What I would say to that is, I'm not sure if it's like just for specific documentaries or whatever with the funding, but I would think that like the relationship, just having it there in general, would like affect the content that they put out. Like knowing that if I do
for sure.
X,
for sure. Well, that's my point, right? Like, there's going to be lots of they're not going to create a documentary about the Koch brothers. Actually, I'd be surprised if they maybe they have done something like that. I don't know, but I'd be surprised if they did. And that would be very smart for the Koch brothers to fund a, and they do. They have so many journalistic outlets. They have Time Magazine. Do you know that? Do you know that they own Time Magazine? Y'all didn't know that, right? So there's a reason we don't hear that much about the Kochs, right? Even though they have like over $100 billion, in like probably more. We don't. They're very private. Anyways, that kind of underscores the point of why it's so important to think about funders. To your point, go ahead, Jacob.
And if I could have one more thing, and it's kind of selfish, but I always ask, like, how does this affect me? Like, I'm consuming media or reading an article. Like, is it worth it for me to get emotionally or like egotistically invested in some topic when I can't change anything about what's happening? Or, is it worth like being passionate about this and reading into it further? I feel like we kind of get obsessed with things, and I've definitely done this before. Like, obsessed with things that we can't do anything about. Like, oh, like this stupid girl on Dr. Phil got like a $10 million deal with whatever. Like, okay, I could get really upset about that, but like, why? So, yeah, that's a question I also ask.
I love that. It's like checking your emotions as you're consuming. It's like, oh wait, something's happened to me, and like that's probably what they want, and like, what's the point? All right. Here's an exercise. And there's wronger answers, but I'm not looking for any. Use your own. We can be flexible. What we mean by worldview, right? That could mean like policy objectives, political spectrum, allies. I don't know. Just okay. So, CNN.
Left leaning.
I would say a lot of it's changing right now. Obviously, without Trump, it's like they lost most of what they stood. I was about to say stood for, but it's like what they stood against. It's like most of their content. So I think the worldview. I don't know if the worldview of CNN is changing, but like what they're actually producing is going to be changing a lot in the next coming years.
Well, it's interesting, right? What is the coherent worldview of a channel of a station that regularly brings on and celebrates Democrats, but also former Republicans that hate Trump, right? So what is the through line across? I don't want to oversimplify and just say CNN is just an anti-Trump channel, but it's also not that wrong. Okay, there's a bunch to go through, so let's just fire through. Fox News.
The opposite.
Pro-Trump.
And I'll add some nuance, but it might depend if you're talking about like Fox News that they play during the day and like their late night television, because that's very different. Because I'll say like I think Fox News during the day, in general, like seems to be pretty local news centric and kind of more like people focused of like how is this affecting like the people in your community versus like these like policy impacts, which I think is a big difference between how they cover news and how CNN covers news. But if you're going to like the late night stuff, I mean, in lawsuits, they will claim that they're entertainment. So that's their worldview when it comes to late night news.
Great point. It's always funny what people say in lawsuits, like the Capitol rioters that they're claiming have been manipulated by Trump, and that they're basically pleading insanity, right? Obviously, they probably don't believe that about themselves, but like to get away with to be above board, people make up all sorts of things about what they are. Like Alex Jones. Argued that he was satire to like avoid a lawsuit once. All right, Breitbart, and it might be helpful to say what's the difference between Breitbart and Fox News in terms of the worldviews.
I don't consume a lot of Breitbart news, I've only like kind of heard things, bits and pieces. They seem way more right leaning than Fox News and way less reliant on like pure factual information than Fox News is. But that's also just my interpretation. I could be very wrong.
Yeah, I don't expect any of you to consume Breitbart, but you won't see stories that are celebrating big corporations, especially like big tech. You won't see anything that's like pro-immigration. You're going to see a lot of, I mean, really only celebration of Republicans, but not Republicans that compromise with Democrats. All right, Al Jazeera. And again, I don't expect you to watch much of this, so I can answer. But do you want to guess?
I don't watch too much Al Jazeera, but I'm gonna guess they are like pro-Muslim, anti-West kind of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't watch a ton of it, but that's what I've observed, especially with the not saying that a lot of what they say is wrong, but just looking at the coverage of like Israel Palestine, it's very slanted towards Palestine. RT is Russia Today. It's funny because Al Jazeera has like their social media stuff. It's called AJ Plus, right? And it's for Western audiences. And so like oftentimes, of course, you're going to make an acronym so that people don't immediately, Russia, or like, foreign word. But anyways, Russia Today. What do you think their worldview is?
I guess they like Putin.
Okay, so Russia RT is a great case of. So you're not wrong, Jacob, but they're not going to make stories that are pro-Putin. At least for the Western audiences, they're going to make stories against the West. But it's like they're like very mainstream, honestly, progressive stances. The West is evil empire. They always hire like Americans and British people to like say these things. Right? It's genius. It's like, and the thing is like, a lot of what they say is like legit, right? But why am I bringing up the concept of a worldview, right? Because it's not about whether like individual facts that people are saying are not. It's not that a lot of them are not true. It's like, what is the consequence? You have all these people that have a particular worldview that they'll never hear anything from RT about America doing like good things. Like they're very, very, very few, right? And so your worldview is effectively you're becoming an agent of Russia, right? And again, I'm not saying that I say not that much of it is this, as far as I've seen, is like fake facts, right? But and so that's something really important for all of us to think about. That what you omit from your coverage is almost just as important as what you include. Hey Freya, good to see you. So we're basically just in this part of it, and I recorded it so you can watch it after the first half if you like. But we're basically going over the different worldviews of like these different stations. This is a dumb question. Do you know what Fox News is?
Yes, of course I do.
Okay. Why? I'm actually.
Like why I know what it is, or like where I've seen it?
Yeah. Why do you know what Fox News is?
Well, usually because it's on the TV guide when our TV plays, and
Wait, what?
Yeah. So we still have a TV with a set-top box. So yeah, so sometimes when we're watching news with it, it's there. It's not often that we play the channel, but yeah, it's always there.
Oh, I see. Okay. is that just something that some Indian telecom companies they just package in sometimes or
No, no, no.
often?
So, no. So, like, there are foreign channels that play on your satellite TV as well.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, Fox News
Got
is
it.
one of them. So, we
Oh,
do get
okay.
international news along with your local coverage.
Oh, interesting. So is it like the same thing where like it's like Tucker Carlson and stuff? Is it just like the same Fox News?
Yeah, like it's essentially the same channel and the
That's so
same news coverage that you would probably get. We get.
okay, interesting. Cool. All right, so the last one is Reason. Does anyone know what Reason is? Okay, so Reason is a I'd say they'd say they're more complex than this, but they're mainly like a libertarian idea worldview. Well, I guess I kind of blew it, but like it's kind of like a libertarian worldview channel. Um, Again, I think their perspective is really interesting, and I don't like. They're basically just not going to show the government like working, right? And so this is they're going to have all these compelling examples, and they're not wrong about these cases that they pull up, right? They'll talk about really expensive government projects that failed, but they're not going to talk much about how the government's working. They're going to talk about how the free market's working and lower regulations work. So let me pose a question. Why might it be helpful to really be frank about what the worldview of each of the media outlets that you're listening to, watching are?
Personally, I think it's because everyone is so fixated on whether we are believing the facts that they're presenting to us or not, that we forget that maybe even if they are true, that they might be one-sided. Like, for example, you're talking about RT just right now and saying how it presents only how the government is not working. It's important to know that even though there are like certain faults, there are certain pros and some good things happening out there. So I think a lot of the times when nowadays when we like open news sites or like news channels or even newspapers for that matter, all pages are like filled with mostly bad news. Like over here, it's at least like increasing COVID cases and stuff that the government is doing wrong and should not have done, and stuff like that. And sometimes people just need like a little tiny ray of hope to like make, yeah.
For sure.
I mean, I think it's important to take what you're consuming from any media outlet with a grain of salt. So you can kind of like see through some of their agenda or whatever motive the author has.
I think understanding your worldview helps you reckon that it doesn't have to be like disinformation or misinformation. It can be the truth, but it can be like the half truth. So, what they're offering is only one side of a multidimensional conversation.
Yeah. For me, so everything that everyone said, and then additionally, something for you all to think about is, well, hopefully this session's already changing the way you see news forever, where you're not just a kind of passive or like half. You're less of a passive consumer of news, and you start to see the news landscape itself as an object, right? And you're viewing the information ecosystem as like a almost like a this is oversimplifying, but it's like a battleground, right? And that itself is important for you to for someone to understand the state of a country or the world sociopolitics. It's essential, right? That you're not just asking yourself, do you agree with a particular article or a channel? You're starting to understand like the different players and what they want, what they care about, who their allies are, their enemies are, and so you're not just a bit player, right, in this like propaganda game. You're seeing it from above, and you're like, oh, okay. And then so your actions are as much as you can be minimize the unintended consequences, and ideally, what you do becomes increasingly just purely increasing the human flourishing of people, short term, long term. We kind of already did this, but let's just review. So actually, we didn't really talk that much about target demo. What do you think their target demo is?
Kind of controversial, but gonna put this out there. I think it's probably like white, female, middle age, but I'm not sure.
And I'll add to that and say East Coast. A lot of their stuff is really East Coast focused. They're also headquartered in Atlanta, so that's telling as well.
Or like East Coast culture, at least, right? Anyone else have anything to add?
I think they're also targeted. This is kind of more of like a mental, like a I just forgot the word for it. Like framing, but like it's a very specific type of liberal, like not somebody who's super far left, because I think there are other outlets that accomplish that.
Yeah.
But like people that are definitely left leaning, but not like, I guess like off the deep end, so to speak.
Yeah.
And they're trying to kind of hug the line a little bit more than other outlets. Like I would say MSNBC is probably way farther left than CNN is.
Yep.
From like what I know of CNN, I think it attempts to target minorities, like not just ethnic and racial, but as well as like women and stuff like that. And I am not entirely sure they get across.
You're not sure they what?
So they actually like get across to their target demographic.
Yeah. All right. So there's been different studies on this, and I know it's probably shifting, but it's Jacob. Everyone was right on. It's funny. It's middle-aged people that self-identify as like center right and say they prefer objective news, and they're women, and they tend to be white, and like kind of educated liberal type people. I guess I bet no one's surprised. All right. Let's look at a real news story. This has been happening over the past let's say the past week. Some of the viral videos have been put out in the last couple of days. So several reports of American Jews being subjected to violence and harassment by pro-Palestinian groups arose this week amid the armed conflict between Israel and Hamas militants. In Los Angeles on Tuesday, a group of Jewish men were attacked while eating and suffered minor injuries. And in New York, a Twitter video showed people being harassed at a restaurant, and kind of commonly agreed that the rise in anti-Semitic incidents has been growing because of the conflict. How would you cover or not cover the story as a highly pro-Palestine reporter?
I think what you have in the parentheses not cover is exactly what a lot of these outlets are doing. You just avoid it, because if you come out against anti-Semitism, it's like, well, are you pro-Israel in this situation? So as a highly pro-Palestinian reporter, I would say, no, I just wouldn't cover it at all.
I would probably make the focus of an article or whatever I was writing, like the mass gatherings of pro-Palestinian people and how they're making a great impact and unifying. Like they'd be like, some incidents happened where they, received like, what do you say, like backlash from like the Jewish community, and some mistakes happened, but we're still like represent like this massive community of pro-Palestine supporters.
Do you know how CNN covered like protests slash riots that led to like in certain cities that had massive okay, just a lot of violence and looting? I mean, you're not going to guess it. They consistently said it was a mostly peaceful protest, mostly peaceful, right? And so what is the frame, right? The frame is that these protests are peaceful. It's just an exception, just an exception, and they might not be wrong, right? Just like depending on what you mean by mostly peaceful, but do you think that Fox News is going to cover like that? Of course not. Of course not. All right, so how would you cover this as a highly pro-Israel reporter?
I think you could like reference more the Hamas attacks and like Hezbollah attacks, like the general. So basically, when I think any news outlet covers the Israel-Palestine conflict, they tend to focus on like how non-violent these attacks are, which is like a very small part of it, and how Palestine does not like, at least the citizens do not like respond in a violent way. So as a pro-Israel reporter, it could be more like, how Hamas is targeting the civilians of Israel, and how it faces backlash in the States, like even then. So yeah, like it's being continued, like the violence is being continued elsewhere in a similar manner, like civilians are still being attacked otherwise.
Yeah, and you'd probably emphasize like they're probably linked to Hamas, right? All around the world.
Yeah, I think they would also show either like stories or statistics that reveal that like a lot of people in Palestine, especially like really religious people, want like all of the land as well, like the same as Israel does, and like just basically want Israel to be gone.
Yeah, so you might emphasize that there's not just like an individual motive, right? This is like this is just like the inevitable, predictable side effects of a radical terrorist organization that wants to totally destroy Israel and Jews. Okay, so how did CNN cover this? So you can disagree with this if you want about how left CNN is according to this indicator. There's this website that's like pretty good, I think, called All Sides, which they look at a story and then they like look at how different outlets are covering the same story. It's often pretty eye-opening, but the way that so CNN basically covered this as a single incident, right? Newsweek is more center, and let's see. This is at least an incident, and then they talk about, I guess, how this is being shared on social media. Nothing remarkable here. On the right, Fox News Online, and the online is a lot different than like Sean Hannity. It's kind of like more just like, I think Zoe knows this. So do you see how they're really focusing on how this is like a trend, right? This shows that this is anti-Semitism, not. So the patterns that all sides say is that, the more right-leaning you are, basically, the more you're going to cover it as a pattern, right? A pattern of anti-Semitism. On the left, it's like individual incidents of like stupid people. All right, so how would you frame this attack on American Jews if you were Hamas? Again, or ignore.
Probably ignore.
I think that's smart. Like a slightly worse game theoretic option is like, say, probably Israel paid these people to attack, but then that would just bring too much. That would bring undue attention to the attacks, right? Israel's government.
I think that you on like blow it out of proportion, relate them to Hamas, the usual. Uh, they're doing this here, they're doing this outside of the region, the whole jazz.
Right, AOC. Does everyone know like what she's been tweeting so far about this whole conflict, this whole like Israel stuff?
She's been relatively pro-Palestine, hasn't she?
Yep.
But I think that her framing would be interesting, because she would probably try to hug the line way more of like, you know, like this, like she would probably call this out as being anti-Semitic if she were to talk about it. I'm not sure if she would, just depending on where she's wanting to focus. But I think she probably would say these are anti-Semitic attacks, but she would still, at the end, kind of keep reverting back to like, we're still needing to support people in Palestine, and like her side of the conflict as well.
So Ilhan Omar is kind of, well, is a Ilhan. I don't know if AOC commented, but Ilhan Omar did because she was kept getting pressed on it, and she said any like attacks just on people just because they're their religion or race is unacceptable or something like that. Ted Cruz. Do you know what Ted Cruz's stance is on Israel? Just like unequivocal, like you're you're on the side of terrorists if you don't like aren't fully backing. You're on the side of terrorists and anti-Semites if you're not fully backing Israel. Ted led a press conference where he literally had like 20 Republican Congress people like just saying like 2-minute speeches about their support of Israel. It was really interesting. So how would you think he would frame this?
It's like an atrocious attack probably sponsored by Hamas, somehow connecting that thread against the Israeli people, interpreted as Jews. Some kind of anti-Semitic crime, probably.
Yeah.
And I think like kind of shifting focus to something like these Middle Eastern terrorist groups are like taking over the Western world and something like that. I don't know.
Joe Biden.
Probably that these were unlawful, hate-driven attacks on American people. He wouldn't frame it probably directly as a challenge of what's going on with Israel and Hamas. He would say these are attacks on American people. We can't have that, and probably try as much as possible to disconnect it from his personal / his administration stance when it comes to the conflict.
So Joe has not said anything yet, as far as I'm aware, as recent as last night. Why do you think it might be smart to not? Why could someone argue why it's smart to not say anything right now?
I mean, like, the obvious answer is like if you take a side, you are immediately like alienating and angering the other group of people, and sometimes it's better not to make enemies, right? Even if it means just not saying anything.
Yeah, I think like people people have been so trained to, I think, unconsciously is not the right word, but like semi-consciously, like identify if you're on someone's team or not, right? So you don't have to have been part of this session to know that if someone is saying anti-Semitic attacks are rising and you know, Palestine, all this support of Palestine is like anti. Well, I'm just kind of exaggerating here. Any support of Palestine is anti-Jew. Like people are really skeptical of. People are just really skeptical of people's statements because they assume that you are part of a faction, right? And I think this has been like a common strategy with the Biden administration of just being really cautious about weighing in on many different things because it can be, it seems like game theoretically it might be, because you can't please anyone, it might be best to just slightly disappoint some people than anger half, right? So you might be disappointing like a bunch of people, like, oh, like I wish he's not, it wasn't the ideal thing that he could have said or not said, right? But like often when you say something, you're like half the country is against you. No. Okay. Cool. Well, looks like we're just almost about the hour. Let's discuss. What did you think about the session, and especially like, do you want to do more stuff like this?
All right, so I'll be like the first to say I don't read a lot of news. It's probably something I need to work on because like I don't really know too much about like, oh yeah, this news media, this outlet. Like I just kind of like try to avoid it. And like if I do consume this, usually pretty passively through like just me scrolling through Instagram. And so I feel like if I had some kind of like assignment before a talk in the future, be like, oh yeah, check out these sources. Let me know what you think about them. I feel like I'll be able to like, have more insights and be able to contribute more to the conversation as we go on.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think it was helpful to have a topic like a current event tying it together too.
One thing I need to shout out is the outbreak in Narnia part. I love that. That, and also I genuinely, I don't think we have such conversations very often. Just because of the fact that people are very pro this or against that in terms of news, at least. And I definitely agree with what Jacob said because I also don't like go through news really actively, just because of the fact that a lot of it is pretty terrible or sad or something, and I don't like doing that. But yeah,
Yeah.
I genuinely like this, and I would love to have more sessions like these.
Cool. Already an idea is we could start like the next session could literally be like, I guess some people could just observe if they wanted to, but like we could have people that are like, okay, let's say this is your role. You're like the propaganda mouth of this faction for this story. Like prepare like a 1 minute, like, you know what I mean? Like 1 minute, like press briefing on it, and then be ready to answer questions or something. I think that would be really fun. Also for the observers, it's just like, and then they could like vote on like who is like most convincing. It's like everyone is like supposed to put on their hat of like like a swing voter type person. You're like, yeah. Yeah, and so the reason why I think it's so, like, we could talk about like theory and like we could talk forever about like theory, right, in a very boring way, but I think you learn so much about, like, you'll never see the news the same if you actually play the news. If you role play as the news, you'll never see it again. Like, and I've before CU. Uh, I won't because it's recorded. I'm not going to go into super detail, but I was definitely playing for a particular faction, right? And in retrospect, it's like I was doing all the things that I am confident any media outlet does, right? I was omitting things. I was exaggerating things, uh, using very like images that were like most eye catching and like etc. And and so I think it's like I guess maybe John Vervaeke would say it's that participatory perspectival knowing that allows you to be really sharp when you see anyone else doing what you've already practiced. It's like builds your defense systems for yourself. And it's also just useful for really anything that you do. Like this is kind of just like marketing. Cool. Anyone else have thoughts before we wrap up?
I really like how you phrased that. It's almost like we're getting a vaccination from the media ecosystem.
Yeah, because and I don't. I almost like the cool thing about like competitions is that you're gonna find your own ways of like selectively collecting facts and then using certain images, right? Like you're gonna like, oh, okay, this is what people do. And it's not like my job to just say, here are the 5 things that media outlets do and that's all they do. It's like they're constantly like innovating, right? In the way that they're trying to like can persuade people. So I guess some homework for all of you, and I'll think about it as well. Like, what is like, let's not do Israel Palestine, but like, let's think of another big story that comes up in the next like 2 weeks, and then we can like pick teams or like different factions, right? And it'll be fun to see who wins.
I'll propose one just because I'm sure there's just gonna be more on this. But like the whole like like the Supreme Court taking up a new abortion case and like the whole like rhetoric on both sides around like that whole situation.
I will say that I think a lot of that may not be a good one to start off with because I know a lot of arguments on one side are like super like religiously based, and less people like I don't know. That would just be like my concern.
Like we're gonna try to make controversial like something that hopefully isn't too controversial. We won't have too strong of opinions about already. The problem is like whenever people are passionate about something, they always want to convince you. So like it requires you to kind of embody some passion, some kind of like zeal about a topic, but don't make the topic too touchy. So that's kind of the dilemma we're in.
What about voting laws? Like the new laws that are coming up for like voter security versus like
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
I think that's a good one. Yeah, religion is I think it's like more ethical to have kids argue it feels like unethical to get people that let's say they believe in abortion, they're like very religiously about it and argue the other side. I think it would be really cool for everyone to pick a side that they wouldn't normally pick as well.
Yeah, my mom was telling me about like the training, I just call it schooling, that her friend went through to be a lawyer, and like they do make you like switch sides in the middle of a debate. I think that's like a really important
Oh really? Oh wow, that's sick.
The other side.
So yeah, before we wrap, let's think about what is the format. What if it was like we don't have to fully think about this right now, but what if it was like, let's say you're role playing someone that's getting on like a Hannity or Tucker, and you're arguing why the Republican philosophy for voting is like the right philosophy and why whatever Democrats are doing is like ridiculous. You're basically okay. It's like whatever increases the political power of your side, and then as it relates to voting, right, in elections, and then you're imagining you're going on that faction's media like talk show, right? So you could be like someone's going on Rachel Maddow, right, and then they're arguing why, or whatever Republicans are doing with elections is evil and stuff like that.
I think it would be cool to maybe do like 2 of those. So like one where the Republican is like the interviewer and one where the Democrat's the interviewer, and you have one from each side, because like it controls a lot of the conversation when like one side gets to ask questions and the other one answers. So you would do one session, like I guess like half of it would be where like a Tucker Carlson type is interviewing a Democrat about this, and then the next one would be like a Rachel Maddow type is interviewing like a Republican person, and then you somehow like involve the audience. Something like that might be cool.
So same side, at least, yeah. So it could be Tucker Republican, Maddow Democrat, and then like a mix of one.
Yeah, I think it'd be cool if it was 4 different people. So
Okay.
like
Okay.
scope of arguments and yeah.
Okay, we'll figure it out. But I think that's a good topic, and thanks all for joining this one. This was really fun. All right, have a great rest of your weekend.
That sounds good, guys. See you next time.